Okay, let's discuss some common tips and tricks when using equalizers. There is a right and a wrong way to use EQs. Now, this is a very opinionated subject, and although these are my opinions, I suggest you form your own. But some of these are very common and have been around a very long time. The most common general EQ moves are used when using corrective versus enhancement EQ. Generally, for corrective EQ, you want to use mostly cuts. And then for enhancements, you might use some boost, but you can also get enhancements by cutting in other areas. So generally speaking, when you're doing a boost, you want to use more of a broad EQ move, a wider Q. And when you're doing your cuts, you want a bit narrower of a Q. You want to cut the frequencies out that you don't need. Now, one big tip I will mention before we get into this. When making EQ moves, one area can affect the other. So think about that carefully. If you cut the bass, you're automatically going to have more highs and vice versa. So you have to think about your EQ moves in stages, and you have to think about what frequencies that you're touching might be affecting other frequencies. Okay, let's get into the tips about how to EQ. Number 1, remove the bad frequencies. Remove room and resonating tones by using narrow cuts. Number 2, enhance the good frequencies. Use wider cuts and boosts to shape the tone broadly. Number 3, create space in the mix. Use EQ to create space by filtering some of the lows and highs in the mix, or carving space into the frequency spectrum of instruments to make room for each other. Number 4, alter the sound. Use EQ to alter an existing sound. A good example of this is by filtering out the highs and lows around 1000 Hertz, and that will give you the classic telephone or megaphone effect on vocals. Okay, now we're going to get into some of the most common tips for using EQs. Tip number 1, always have an intention. Do not start randomly cutting and boosting frequencies to see what you think might work or sound good. Figure out what you want to achieve, then determine what type of EQ will help you get there. Tip number 2, prioritize cuts first, but to boost if needed. When boosting with an EQ, it messes with the phase of the sound and affects additional frequencies, not just the boosted frequencies. The concept is too much boosting can ruin the audio. It is recommended to use subtractive EQ as much as possible. If you want more highs, turn down the lows, for example. Tip number 3, do not apply EQ in solo mode. Some people like to solo the track they are working on and start EQing. The problem with this approach is that you are not referencing the rest of the mix, so all of your moves are invalid. No one will listen to your mix in solo. Always EQ with the full track playing, so your EQ moves work with the context of the mix. Tip number 4, do not rely on EQ alone for tone. Do not expect EQ to completely change the tone of a sound. EQ can only boost or cut frequencies that already exist. If you cannot get the sound you are looking for with EQ, you likely need to look for a new sound or go back to the recording phase. Tip number 5, EQ in small changes. Lots of small changes will add up over time. If you are a beginner, start by trying to EQ no more than 3 dB per move, and do not make too many drastic EQ moves to one sound. Instead, make one EQ move, then move to a new sound and make another move. Keep going, and all of the small changes will add up to a massive change that works in context with your mix. Tip number 6, what order should I EQ in? Although I usually prefer to EQ before compression, there are times that the opposite may apply. I like to remove what I want to compress, but that won't stop me from adding another EQ after for color or more boosts and or cuts. Although there is practical strategies and best practices to follow, do remember there are no rules. Tip number 7, remove mud to create clarity. One of the most problematic frequencies is the low end, especially the low mids for most beginners. Music starts to sound muddy if there is buildup in this region. If your music lacks clarity or openness, try cutting in this region. Tip number 8, do not overdo the top end. Some people add too many highs, which clarity and crispness reside. When you add too many highs, the music starts to sound too sharp, tinny, and hurts the ear. Problematic frequencies in this region I find beginners often leave in their mix tend to lie in the 5 kHz to 7 kHz range and 11 kHz to 14 kHz range. Tip number 9, the music is in the mid-range. There is a famous saying that states the music is in the mid-range. If you think about it, If you were to remove the lows and the highs of a mix, you would still be able to recognize the music and the mix. If you were to do the opposite and remove the mid-range, you would not be able to clearly decipher the mix. Focus on the mid-range. Tip number 10, mix in mono. When applying EQ and level changes, do it in mono. It helps prevent phase issues while monitoring and gives you a better perspective. It may sound weird, but it will help, trust me. I also like to pan tracks in mono as well. If you do, your mix will sound wide and immense. Tip number 11. You can't polish a turd. The ever-famous saying goes, and applies to music production. You cannot use EQ to make a poor recording or a sample sound good. You cannot add stuff that isn't there, only emphasize stuff that is. And that's an overview on how you can use EQ and a bunch of tips that you can use while using EQ in your music productions. If you have any questions, shoot me a comment down below. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and the bell notification will keep you up to date. Once again, my name is Freddie from Distinct Mastering, and have a great day.